The Haunting of Pluckley Village, a story from Kent, November 1987. Pluckley, Kent, England. It was an unusually cold November when Arthur moved to Pluckley, a small village in Kent said to be one of the most haunted places in all of England. He'd always been a skeptic, charmed more by Pluckley's quaint appearance and the good price on a small cottage near the edge of the forest than any fascination with its darker side. But within days of his arrival, he began to sense that something was off. The villagers were quiet, guarded, and more than a few warned him in a hushed voice about the woods and lanes after dark. There was talk of apparitions that haunted the village, a red lady who wandered the graveyard, a phantom coach drawn by invisible horses, and a mournful spirit known as the Screaming Man, whose anguished cries could sometimes be heard echoing through the night. Arthur brushed off their warnings, certain it was all part of the village's notorious reputation. The cottage was charming, ivy-covered stone house with small windows and a cosy fireplace. The previous owner, an elderly man named Henry, had died only months before, and many of his belongings remained, adding an unsettling feeling of somebody else's life lingering in the space. Despite this, Arthur settled in quickly, spending his days painting in the nearby fields and his evenings by the fire, reading and trying to ignore the occasional creak or groan from the old house. One night after a long day, Arthur decided to go for a late walk through the village. The night air was still, unnervingly quiet. He wandered towards St. Nicholas Church, passing the local pub, the Black Horse, where the few patrons were speaking in low voices. As he walked, a strange mist began to rise, thick and clinging to the ground, obscuring the path ahead. A chilling breeze rustled through the nearby trees, and Arthur, feeling the hairs on his neck stand up, quickened his pace. As he neared the church, he spotted a figure standing alone in the churchyard. It was a woman, clad in a long dark red gown, her head bowed as she seemed to be placing flowers on a grave. Her presence was strange but oddly peaceful. He watched her for a moment, mesmerized by her stillness, before he felt an inexplicable urge to speak. "Excuse me," he called softly. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She remained motionless, her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the grave. Arthur approached cautiously, his footsteps barely making a sound on the damp earth. When he was just a few feet away, he stopped, his heart hammering in his chest as the woman slowly turned to face him. Her face was pale, her eyes are hollow, and a strange sadness flickered across her expression. Her dress was unlike anything he'd seen. It looked centuries old, frayed at the edges and stained, with what he could only describe as dark patches. But the most unnerving part was her gaze. Her eyes were filled with an ancient sorrow, as if she'd carried the weight of lifetimes. Before he could speak again, she vanished into thin air, dissolving like mist in the breeze. Arthur stumbled back, his heart pounding, and looked around wildly, but she was gone. He'd been alone with her, he was sure of it, and she'd simply disappeared. Shaken, he turned to leave the graveyard, but as he walked, he heard a faint sound behind him. It started as a low moan, growing louder and more anguished, echoing through the night. He recognized the wail as unmistakably human, a voice filled with agony and terror. The sound grew, rising to a scream that seemed to pierce the night, until it was all Arthur could hear, ringing in his ears. He turned to look, his body frozen in fear, but he saw no one. Finally able to move, Arthur fled the churchyard, not stopping until he reached the sanctuary of his cottage. That night he barely slept, his mind filled with images of the woman's sorrowful face and the harrowing scream that had filled the night. Over the next few weeks, Arthur's experiences only grew stranger. He would wake in the night to faint whispers echoing through his cottage, though no one was ever there. On several occasions, he swore he heard the sound of horses' hooves on the cobbled streets outside his window, but when he peered out, He could see nothing but darkness, and each night as he lay awake he'd hear the distant, mournful scream that seemed to drift on the wind, carrying the same sorrow he'd seen in the eyes of the woman in the graveyard. Determined to understand what was happening, Arthur began speaking with some of the older villagers. They were reluctant to share too much, but after some coaxing, one elder woman told him about the Red Lady. She'd been a woman of noble birth, tragically separated from her young lover. She'd died while waiting for him. Some said from a broken heart, and others whispered that she had taken her own life, doomed to wander the graveyard where he had promised to meet her. The screaming man, she explained, was a different story. He'd been a farm worker trapped by a landslide in the 18th century. The villagers had tried to dig him out, but the ground was too unstable, and he was buried alive. His desperate cries haunting the air long after he'd been swallowed by the earth. Since then, the anguished spirit was known to wail through the village, his cries sometimes heard by travellers in the dead of night. Arthur listened, unnerved but fascinated, as he left the woman's cottage. She took his hand, her face grave as she warned him. "Mind yourself near the woods and stay away from the graveyard after dark," she said. "Once the spirits of Pluckley know you've seen them, they'll follow you. They remember who they've shown themselves to." The next evening, Arthur sat by his window looking out toward the village. A thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the streets in a ghostly haze. He felt the strange pull again, an urge to go out into the night, to return to the churchyard where he'd first seen the Red Lady. Ignoring all the villagers' warnings, he wrapped a coat around himself and stepped into the mist. As he neared the churchyard, he felt the same eerie silence settle over him, thicker than the fog. Shadows twisted in the corners of his vision, and the air grew cold, biting into his skin. When he reached the graveyard, he saw her again, the Red Lady, standing at the same grave, her face shrouded in sorrow. But this time, she was not alone. A dark figure hovered nearby, a man with a tortured expression, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth opened, and a scream, raw and filled with anguish, tore through the night. Arthur stumbled back, pressing his hands to his ears, but the scream persisted, echoing through the churchyard louder than anything he had ever heard. The Red Lady turned her head, her hollow eyes meeting Arthur's. Her gaze was filled with a pleading sorrow, a silent request he could barely understand, but he felt it. She was begging for release, for someone to tell her story, to remember her pain. The screaming man's wails filled the air, and the Red Lady began to fade, her figure dissolving into the mist, her gaze fixed on him until the very last moment. Then, in the space of a breath, they were both gone, leaving only the echo of that anguished scream hanging in the air. Arthur left Pluckley soon after, unable to shake the ghosts that had found him. He spoke little of his experiences, but in the years that followed he was haunted by dreams of the Red Lady and the screaming man, their faces etched into his memory. Even in sleep he could hear the echo of their voices, the sorrow and pain that bound them to Pluckley's shadowed streets. To this day, the village of Pluckley is known for its spirits, its legends passed down through generations, and for those who wander its lanes and fields at night, the warning remains. The ghosts of Pluckley do not forget those who have seen them, and once you have heard their cries, you'll carry their sorrow with you forever.